Welcome back, everyone, to Remember What's Next. Welcome back, Ken Spiro.
Always good to be back. Just back from Israel as of yesterday.
Crazy.
Got my
Amazing.
recharge. I got rejuvenated.
Amazing. Yeah, you can really feel the difference when you go in and out. You're like, wow, it really is just a different world out here. So
Absolutely, absolutely.
fascinating.
More
We're
now than
okay,
ever.
so perfect timing because we're going to go into part two of our conversation last week, where you laid the groundwork for us to be able to start to understand this kind of almost brewing civil, I don't know, civil war, but definitely civil disconnect between the religious community and the IDF. And how do we have religious people and secular people respect each other's values and work together in a country that there's a lot of arguments about what the central focus or the values or the pillars of this country should be, with a 3,000-year-old history to it. Okay, so last week, if you haven't listened to the episode from last week, please go back and listen to that first before you listen to this one. It will make much more sense. In this episode, we're catching up into the modern day. So, what is happening on the ground in terms of the protests from the Haredi community against having to serve in the army in any capacity? And how is the IDF responding? How is the government responding? What does this look like in public opinion, both inside Israel and outside of Israel? And how are we supposed to understand what's going on here? Because I think to the untrained eye, what we're seeing is a country at war and people in their country who live as part of the country, and benefit from a lot of what the country provides for them, but now is refusing to serve. But there are other parts to that story, and I think we don't always talk about all the different, and there's misconceptions in the religious community about what it means for a kid to go and serve in the army, and is that safe for them, not just physically, but religiously, and that's important. So where do we start now that we have the background to untangle what is going on?
Okay. So yeah, that is very much a very present issue in what's going on in Israel today. It's in the news a lot, the protests, but I think we need Ellie to fill in the gap between what we talked about last week, and I'll do a teeny review of that and what's happened since, because by understanding the process, we get a much clearer sense of where we are today and where we need to be going collectively. So we talked about basically short overview of previous episode was that we talked about that Zionism was largely, I have to generalize in a huge way, but largely founded by Eastern European Ashkenazi Jews who had left their Judaism behind, not exclusively, but overwhelmingly secular Jews who came from often religious or traditional backgrounds. So they knew something, but were looking to create a new version of a nationalist, in keeping with the spirit of nationalism that was very prevalent in Europe in the 19th century. The solution to the Jewish question of how we will escape from all the persecution and finally be able to breathe is our own nation.
And just
And
to
these
say,
are
like, Zionism doesn't discount the fact that there were still Jews living in Israel at that time. Zionism was the movement to create Israel into a functioning sovereign state for the Jewish people. So the idea that it was just Zionism that created the state of Israel is crazy because there's Jews that have been there for thousands of years. So I just want to
exactly.
clarify that for anybody who maybe is listening to this for the first time.
Very good. Yes, I always say we're the newest old nation. Jews were around the land of Israel for many, 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 many centuries. First and Second Commonwealth. Go back and read read some Jewish history. Read my crash course in Jewish history book. Listen to previous episodes. There was never a period of time when there were no Jews in Israel. But what we see with Zionism is a massive increase in the Jewish population of Israel and the creation of a modern Jewish state, a modern Jewish commonwealth after 2,000 years of being expelled from our land and the land being occupied by mostly Muslims, but other groups of people who occupied the land and conquered it one from the other. But the movement was overwhelmingly founded by a bunch of Jews who did not see the creation of a modern Jewish nation state as something that was spiritual or religious. The Bible had only the use of the Bible was his historical document and as a connection to the land and our history, but that was it. And therefore, it met with tremendous opposition from the majority of religious leadership. When I say religious, we're talking about Ashkenazi Jews of Europe. And at this period of time, the vast majority of Jews are now living in Eastern Europe in the Russian Empire, which includes Ukraine, parts of Poland, White Russia, Russia itself, Lithuania. Most of them seeing that, as we read last week, Tzadok Hakon of Lublin, that we only lost the land because we didn't keep the Torah, that how will we expect a bunch of people who are basically anti-religious to be able to rebuild the state? And then I ended up by talking about how, all of human history and our history is an interplay between the decisions we make and God's infinite knowledge and control. That whatever happens in history is always the will of God. And that the state of it was successful, not without tremendous challenges and constant warfare and terrorism and infighting, but an impossible event, a unique event in human history that a people who lost their land twice in history, went into exile, came back, reestablished a state, and that state flourished. So I ended up with the thought that neither I would say the most of the rabbinic leadership of Eastern Europe or the secular Zionist founders of the state of Israel would be, I would say, pleased. They certainly would be kind of surprised by what Israel is today, which is a very successful state, not without its challenges and problems, but remarkably successful. Where now, despite the state is not only founded, but it's the largest Jewish population in the world, and the economy is doing great despite being constantly in a state of terrorism, warfare, and economic blockade, and boycotting and everything else. And also that the majority of Israelis, they did not create this like kind of secular nationalist paradise. The majority of Israelis are pretty open, and there's a very high percentage of Jews who are actually observant, Orthodox, and a very significant percentage, equally as many, and I believe is the majority of the country, that are traditional Jews who are keeping kosher, keeping the holidays, very connected. They may not keep Shabbat 100%. They have a Friday night dinner, but much more connected spiritually, the vast majority of Jews in America who are not Orthodox. So we kind of have these two diametrically opposed groups, but we forgot something we really have to talk about, which is the founding of what we call religious Zionism. Because really, when you think about it, modern terminology aside, our connection to the land is religious nationalism. Judaism is not purely a religious identity. We are a nation and a people. We have a homeland. Like I said previously, you can practice Judaism in diaspora, but you can only live it in the land of Israel. And we have, going all the way back hundreds of years, rabbis who were, for spiritual reasons and having the bigger picture of recognizing that Israel is not a destination, it is the destiny of the Jewish people, were actively doing whatever they could to try and recreate a Jewish presence in the land of Israel. Like I mentioned, Rabbi Elijah of Vilna, who lived over 200 years ago, talking about late 19th century great rabbinic leader who sent 500 of his students to the land of Israel. And that's the rebirth of the Ashkenazi community, meaning the Jews who come from Christian Eastern Europe in the land of Israel. Prior to that, the vast majority of Jews living there were Middle Eastern Mizrahi Jews. If for no other reason, they were living in all the neighboring countries, and they could easily migrate in and out. And that was the natural pool of people who would settle in the land, despite it being very depressed, backward, disease-ridden. Jews always wanted to be there. But then you have other rabbinic personalities. You have people like Rabbi Yehuda Shlomo Alkalai, who is a Sephardic rabbi, who was very much into the notion of Jews learning how to live as a people in their land, coming back to our agricultural roots, reestablishing, this is a big movement we'll see in the late 19th, early 20th centuries. We Jews living in diaspora had primarily migrated into cities. Besides losing our national identity, we had lost our knowledge of how to basically live in our own country and do things like farm. It wasn't a Jewish thing to be in crafts and trades and agriculture. They were more doing, for various reasons, trading and small businesses and stuff like that, finance, whatever Jews could do that were allowed to do. That was something that would give them some level of subsistence existence. But you have a lot of other people doing that. You have like Rabbi Tzvi Kalisher, who, in the 19th century, who's one of the early Ashkenazi leaders, and the idea of practical action is needed. And we're going to talk about this more. We talked about it before, really, whether we have to wait for redemption or we should be moving towards reestablishing our homeland. God took us out of Egypt to bring us to the land of Israel. We need to go home. Rabbi Shmuel Moliver, who also late 19th century, who is the founder of one of the founders of an organization called Chovev Zion, which is the Lovers of Zion. These were all movements which were basically involved in practically preparing Jews to return physically and to be able to financially reestablish their existence within the land of Israel and be successful. But one of the most interesting personalities is Rabbi Yitzhak Yehuda Reines, who died in 1915, and he's the founder of the Mizrahi movement. Because along with the practical concerns of how do we reestablish a Jewish homeland, how do we set up the physical infrastructure, how to redo farming, how do we set up an army, there's a whole spiritual component to this, which you can't separate out of it. That again, it's the most basic promise that God makes to the Jewish people is not to give them the Torah. Don't misunderstand me. There's no Jewish people without Torah and mitzvot, but it's to bring us into a land, to create a holy people in a holy land, and viewing this whole process as a part of the process of redemption. So the Mizrahi movement was founded at the very beginning of the 20th century as kind of a way of synthesizing that modern secular nationalism with the traditional Jewish connection, merging Medinat Yisrael, the idea of a Jewish state, with Eretz Israel, the idea of the land of Israel. And I just wanted to read the Mizrahi Manifesto from 1902. And again, Rabbi Reines was really the rabbinic founder of the movement. And listen to what he says, because it makes a lot of sense. He says, in the land of diaspora, the soul of our people, our holy Torah can no longer be preserved in its full strength, nor can the commandments which comprise the entire spiritual life of the people be kept in their original purity. It's true. It's a huge percent of the commandments we cannot keep without being a nation in our land. He goes on to say, the people have found one remedy for this affliction, to direct their hearts to the one place which has always been the focus of our prayers, Zion and Jerusalem. It has therefore been agreed by all those who love the spirit of their people and are faithful to their God's Torah that the reawakening of the hope for the return to Zion will provide a solid foundation as well as a special quality to our people. It will serve as a focus for the ingathering of our spiritual forces and a secure fortress for our Torah and sanctity. So he's saying something. If you read that again, it's super powerful. It's not a zero-sum game. Jewish nationalism, Judaism, diaspora and clinging to the Torah versus secular nationalism in the land of Israel. It's creating what is a modern like hybrid, which is not new. It's of recreating Jewish spiritual identity, like the tree planted in the soil of the land of Israel, to enable us to function, live, and grow in the most natural environment for us physically and spiritually, which means it's not just about practical stuff, which is what the secular Zionists were really concerned with. How do we escape anti-Semitism? How do we stop, intermarriage and things like that? They weren't so, how do you preserve our identity without those threats, especially the physical threats? It's about switching to the proactive side of recognizing that this is like, like high test fertilizer for Jewish spirituality and Jewish historical mission is putting that tree back in that soil. So this is that movement which will give birth to its own, political parties, and when Israel becomes a state, and you have the national religious parties. The original version of it no longer exists. So you have like two extremes, and you have the middle. And of course, the last person we have to mention is Rabbi Abraham Isaac Cohen Cook, also from Eastern Europe. Again, with the exception of Rabbi Alkali, almost all of these leaders are Eastern European leaders, and we see there are not insignificant number of said rabbis. Rav Kook is interesting. He's kind of been erased from the Haredi ultra-Orthodox worldview in Israel, but he himself was. One side of his family was, he was Volozhin Yeshiva, and the other side was Hasidish. He's a very profound thinker. To today, I really have a tough time learning Rav Kook. I find the Hebrew very esoteric, and his ideas are very high. But he's the first chief rabbi of pre-state Palestine under the British mandate. The British, remember, came in 1917 and controlled Israel to the founding of the state in 1948. And he's the one who really put the spiritual view, the Torah historical view on the redemptive process of what was going on with secular Zionism. He caught a lot of flack for this because he was willing to work with, engage with secular Zionist leadership and the whole vision. And basically, again, I can't do Rev Cook justice, but he basically was saying that the secular Zionists who are not working lishma means doing it for the sake of heaven, for redemption, for the Jewish mission, but they are doing it, and not even knowing that they're doing it. And as I said previously, the what happened as an experience of living in diaspora for so long, of getting so used to it, even when it was uncomfortable, the proactive nature of the religious world kind of disappeared. I mean, people aren't, we're going to wait, like it's like the Rambam says, his 13 principles of, that are based on his teachings, Maimonides. Number 12 of his 13 principles. Even though he'll delay, I will wait for him. So we're just going to wait. Redemption will come when the Messiah shows up. Rev Cook is saying, no, no, no. The process is already happening now. And ideally, and we ended up talking about this previously with Rabbi Weinberg, I mentioned seeing that, that when he was started the whole Baal Tshuva movement in many ways, seeing that God wanted his children to come home. We just need the Orthodox Jewish world to stop being so reactive and defensive and start going out there. We got an amazing product. We got the best product on the planet Earth that's transformed humanity. Let's go out and sell it, not by force, but by being a good example, by showing people the beautiful wisdom, the depth, the beauty, the meaning, the relevance. We can do that. So Rav Kook is basically saying the same thing. God decided that he wants his children to come home. He's shutting down diaspora. That process has been incredibly accelerated
Hmm.
since Rav Kook's time, and we saw it
Hmm.
actually happening. I would say at the end of the 19th century is where it really begins. And these
And
secular
by the way,
Zionists,
just
yeah,
to mention, sorry to interrupt, but Rav Kook himself was initially against the whole Israel project. He and his father, who were big Rebbeim, they were like, nah, they were on side with the idea that, oh, these are these, secular um, people who want to build a state that doesn't align with our values. But then when he went to Israel, everything changed. And he
right.
he really was able to acknowledge, respect, and even in moments like elevate the fact that these were holy people doing holy work, even though they themselves would never say that, right? Like Rev Cook always talked about the importance of the atheist is that an atheist doesn't wait around for God to do something when you can do it yourself. Like there's a certain, perspective that he had, which I think made him loved and endeared to all sides and also hated by all sides who didn't want to come together. So I think he really was a bridging figure who so beautifully was able to hold the union of disparate sides. And also, I think because he actually came from a home of, like you said, Hasidish and Yeshivish, like his parents came from different lines. And so he lived in a house where opposites were able to come together in a certain way, communities that disagreed with each other. So he really was able to contribute this beautiful viewpoint, and to hold as the chief rabbi that every single person here is holy and holds their part of the puzzle. And this puzzle, like this is happening whether we like it or not. And this is still a holy venture.
Yeah, exactly. Very well stated. And again, we're dealing with a time when you really did have a lot of these people, be they the big uh, secular Zionist leadership that became the political leadership, or even the academic cultural leadership, um, who were really, in many ways, anti-Torah and had a very negative attitude towards it. Uh, but the average, the average rabbinic leadership and the average person does not have this view of what's going on. The big picture was just absent from a few people who just could stand back and see, that this is the end game of Jewish history is redemption. And even these people who are, some of them, anti-religious, even though they're doing it for the exact opposite reasons of what God may want, and not trying to establish a holy people in a holy land. Nonetheless, they are setting up that infrastructure, as I mentioned last week. that movement we call secular Zionism accomplished some pretty amazing physical things in putting in the physical infrastructure to enable the absorption of, millions of immigrants and refugees, and to enable the creation of a modern state in a desert surrounded by enemies and be successful. So he was a really unique personality who unfortunately has kind of been shunted aside, of course, in the religious, nationalist Zionist movement, Dati Leumi, he is really one of the great figures. They have their own rabbinic leadership. It's also interesting to me that in the Ashkenazi yeshiva world, be it in Israel or especially in America, people have no idea of these people. Rabbi Druckman, they just don't understand that there's a whole nother branch that is super serious about Torah and God and has managed to synthesize this in. And it's kind of the bridge between the two ideas. But this is, but what I really wanted to talk about, Ellie, we see, and we see, by the way, that today, even in the diaspora, if you go to, and you'll see this, the big difference in the school systems. I speak in a lot of schools in America. If you look at, people often kind of merge modern Orthodoxy with the knitted kippah crowd of the land of Israel. There are certain similarities in that both those communities are more engaged and less isolated, but there are big differences. And there are a lot of nuanced versions of what we call Dati Leumi, the religious nationalist crowd, from extreme gigantic soup bowl kippas with peyot, the side curls that go down to their, down to their knees, some of them, who are just as religious and unbelievably dedicated to that, and often living on hilltops in the middle of Samaria and Judea. And the less, it's not just everyone wearing a knit kippah is this one kind of Jew, just like not everyone wearing a black kippah is just one kind of Jew. Um, but what they do have in common with modern Orthodoxy in America, which you don't find in the yeshivish world, the black-hatted world of America, is not Zionist. There's not an effort to be teaching Hebrew and
Right.
preparing the kids for Aliyah. Modern Orthodoxy in America, which certainly this is not a class on that, and it certainly has its challenges, is very much more focused on, from its inception, of pushing the idea of Jewish nationalism and pushing the kids in the schools to actually go live in the land of Israel. That is the future. We don't want to perpetuate the diaspora, which has no future. We want to be preparing to go back. And the best way to do that is to prepare our children as they're raised to breathe in the air of the Holy Land where they're still living in diaspora. And you
Yeah, I
shared a
think
story about your own son with me. I want you to maybe tell our listeners about, because I
yeah,
think
it
it's a
was
great
my
example.
son's graduation. He goes to a B'nai Akiva school, and it was just incredibly beautiful to hear, first of all, the incredible academic and Jewish learning that's going on in that school, the intense conversations about meaning, truth, and in a way, it's not even that they're pushing Israel. It's just fully accepted that the land is a part of our mitzvah observance. The land is a part of who we are as a people. So it's not like recruitment, it's acceptance. Like this is just the truth. We are a people in relationship with a God, ourselves, each other, and a land. And that all of those things show up in how we practice Judaism. And it was just incredibly beautiful to see a room full of, in some ways diverse looking, totally like committed, religious, smart Jews who love Israel and relate to it and speak about it, whether it's the valedictorian speeches, whether it's the different awards that they're giving out, that it's completely a part of their world. So it's obvious, like, that a certain, like, I think 30 to 40% of every single graduating class of that school ends up making Aliyah and moving to Israel, which is wild. So I think it's a very beautiful mix, and it made me very happy that we found that particular path for our kids, where they are deeply, Shomer Shabbos, Shomer Kashrut, totally holding the mitzvahs, and cool and modern, and want to go live in Israel. So it's a really interesting mix in my opinion. So yeah, it was cool. It was good.
Well, I think you pointed out the point that obviously in the yeshiva world in America, for instance, Israel's constantly talked about the awareness of Israel, is there, but the difference is the practical nature of it, whether people are actually taking the steps to. I always say people go over there. I get this conversation living now, having temporarily relocated and soon moving back home to the land of Israel. How few people I interact with here are actually, you know, pushing their kids, encouraging their kids to a lot of the yeshiva world today of America. Well, the kids will go to Israel for a year or maybe 2 years to learn, but they're not planning to stay. And I think it's a huge mistake because I believe that we belong in Israel and God is shutting down diaspora, as I said before. But that's really the difference. Whether you're practically preparing your kids, I know that even in the case of my family, where I was not raised religious, but three of the four of them, myself and two of my three siblings became religious and moved to Israel. My parents followed, and they never became religious themselves. You follow the children, especially the grandchildren. So that's a very interesting point. We understand now the background. If people go back and listen to the first part of it, we understand where it comes from. But what I'd like to talk about in the time we have left is like, okay, so what happened since then? So you had maybe you had early generations of rabbinic leadership in Europe, which were hardcore, staunchly opposing uh, the creation secular Zionism. Another great example is Rabbi Elchanan Wasserman, who was killed by the Nazis in 1941. He was a very hardcore opponent of Jews leaving Eastern Europe. Don't go to America. Don't go to Israel. These are places that are spiritually dangerous for you for different reasons. There's no Torah infrastructure. We talked about this last week. It was kind of self-fulfilling prophecy. If you don't send the rabbinic leadership to these places, you basically you abrogate. You're giving it to the other people to set up. There was the Reform movement, the conservative, whatever they set up in America, and very little Orthodox Jewish presence until right before, during, and after the Holocaust is when it really takes off. In the land of Israel, you're basically allowing the secular Zionist leadership to set up the state. So you had that kind of very strong opposition. And like I said at the end of last episode, that, in history, God decides. In halacha, we decide. He gave us the Torah. It's not up in heaven. But clearly, the fact that despite the notion of much of the rabbinic leadership, this is never going to succeed. It did succeed, and now that center of the Jewish world, which was Eastern Europe, is now devoid of a Jewish population. It's the largest Jewish cemetery in the world, and ironically, we have the two largest Jewish communities, and the most Torah are precisely in the two places where 100 years ago these rabbis, and don't get me wrong, I'm not judging them. It's always easy to be right in hindsight, but
Right.
it was God's plan that a Jewish state be reestablished, and that I gotta get you out of Europe, and that's exactly what happened. We got the
So now that we have these huge religious populations in Israel, this is now taking that age-old sort of animosity towards each other and putting it into a situation where it's desperately needed to sort it out. So
yeah,
what's going on now on the ground with the
right,
religious population? How does this work? Because it used to be, as you said last time, I think a very small population that is now an enormous population. What's the relationship between them, the government, the IDF? How does this work and why is it falling apart?
right. Right. So the last thing to throw in there before we get to that piece is what happened since the founding of the state. There's no question that the Labor Party, which were the secular left-wing Zionist party, ran the country until 1977. There's no question that it had negative attitude towards religious Jews and also a very negative attitude towards the Mizrahi community, which is a huge percentage of Israel. They stuck them in really bad places in the middle of nowhere, in deserts and development towns. Many of them, the Mizrahi Jews did not go through the Reform movement and the Enlightenment. They didn't live in places that have yet to have those things. Would that Islam reformed itself and had some enlightenment in the Arab world, it would be Islamic world, it would be great. So they came religious/traditional, and many of them ended up being in very bad environments, secular, left-wing kibbutzim, a lot of them. They're much closer, and they didn't go through the whole process. And there's plenty of secular Mizrahi Jews, but I always say Sephardi Mizrahi Jews are really Orthodox Jews. Some of them are just not observant. They're so much more connected than the average Ashkenazi. They just have this coding within their hearts that's there. All you have to do is go watch the penitential prayers being said called Slichot before Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur at the Western Wall, and you have 40, 50,000 almost completely Mizrahi Jews, most of them like girls wearing jeans and t-shirts, and they're all there. I'm talking about at 12:30 at night till 1:30 in the morning, till 1 o'clock in the morning doing this. You see that they have that. But a lot of damage really was done. And it could have happened very differently had, the Jewish world rabbinic leadership acted differently. But that's the past is the past. It's so where are we today? As I said before, the country has, despite attempts to maybe create a secular state, that was not successful, thank God. I think the majority of Israel, as I said before, are religious, traditional, and very open. We saw, especially with October 7th, was an accelerator event for the Jewish people. We saw how, a big spiritual reawakening. You see it in the army. You see these units going into combat, which the majority of them are not religious, but they're all like praying. And the guys, like the secular soldiers, they're putting their hands on each other's heads because they're not wearing a kippah, yarmulke, but they want to have their heads covered when they're saying holy words. And my son in reserve duty told me they were giving out in the Gaza war. He's been there many times as a reservist. Tzitzit, the strings, that everyone's taking them. Even guys who aren't wearing kippot, they want their real bulletproof vest and their spiritual bulletproof vest. So from the bottom up, the country is really moving in a direction. People feel something is happening. But unfortunately, we see that a certain ossification has taken place from the top down. And it's interesting, whereas initially the religious parties were not really so into, or the religious groups were not just playing ball with the secular Zionists. What we've seen over the last, we're going on 78 years of the Jewish state, they now play ball, a lot of them. You have two major religious parties. One is called United Torah Judaism, which is a combination of Degel HaTorah, which is the Lithuanian non-Hasidic version, and Aguda. They came together to make like an Ashkenazi political party. And it's not out of a love of Zion. It's out of practical idea that we're not Zionists, but we will dance with the secularists in the country, especially the right-wing parties like the Likud party that Bibi Netanyahu runs, because we want a piece of the pie. And you also have Shas, which is the Sephardi ultra-Orthodox party that was founded in the 1980s. And all three of these parties tend to act together. So these are the Orthodox parties, which are not Zionist parties, yet they are willing to participate in the government. You have then other groups of people who are, no, we don't want to have anything to do. The most extreme, which I don't even want to talk about because I feel I have to go to a ritual bath and mikveh after, is Notoria Karta, this small, ridiculous group of people who look very religious but are so off, who show up at pro-Iranian and pro-Palestinian rallies and apologize to the civilians of Gaza for the damage caused by the secular state. That is a very small minority, but they get a lot of great photo time. Nothing better than having them marching in Hasidic garb with keffiyehs on, with pro-Palestinian signs. But you also have like Satmar, we talked about previously, Hasidic group, which is vehemently anti-Zionist. We talked about Rabbi Joel Teitelbaum, who managed to flee during the Holocaust, who felt that, that the Zionists are forcing the hand of the non-Jews and violating the oaths that God made us swear that we wouldn't try and forcibly create a Jewish state, even though, as I said in the previous episode, we did not force it. Coming back is not, the nations of the world got together with the Balfour Declaration and the UN votes that took place November 29th, 1947, 33-13, that kind of stuff. So, but they don't basically play ball. They stay outside of the government. Many of these people, they're not taking money from the government, whereas a lot of, for practical reasons, of these ultra-Orthodox Jewish political parties will do it because they want a piece of the pie. So you have that group in there. So now you have a big mishmash, but the difference really is, and this is where I think it's really interesting, is that, and of course, then you have other extremes. You have like Peleg Yerushalayim, which is Rabbi Shmuel Auerbach, who are the guys who are leading most of these protests. Really, what we have, Ellie, which is most upsets me, and it really is based on a lot of what we've talked about in previous episodes, especially the ones we did on trauma, is to understand where Israel is today in 2026. And we already got the long view of where we're at and what's happened and how things have evolved. But we see that today in Israel, the hardcore left is fizzing out. There are very few of these people left, by the way. Really, hardcore communist leftist Jews, there's almost none of those left. The most of the country is kind of middle of the road and open. And as people might be surprised to hear, and as we mentioned previously, the most conservative people politically in this country are 18 to 35-year-olds. the average age of the Ashkenazi protesters against Netanyahu's government and whatever, I see them. I just saw them last, when I was in Israel, last Motzi Shabbos. There are a bunch of Ashkenazi Jews from the coastal plain, like Tel Aviv area, who I would say the average age is 60 plus, probably 65, 70. That's not where the country's holding.
Wow.
But as we talked about in the episodes on trauma, and I mentioned there, the Ashkenazi world in general is more traumatized than the Sephardic world. It went through a worse historical experience of pogroms and ghettoization and expulsion and Khmelnytsky massacres and crusades and Holocaust. But then it went through a period of several centuries of spiritual trauma, where even when the attacks weren't happening for a brief period of time, you know, mid, 19th century Western Europe and emancipation and things were looking sort of kind of good. Then the spiritual trauma began because that unleashed being loved to death by non-Jews unleashed a lot of assimilation, which was also happening in Eastern Europe, by the way. It's a myth to think that Eastern Europe was poor religious, but staying religious. Eastern Europe was falling apart. It was falling apart. A lot of people were leaving and migrating into communism, socialism, Bundist movements, secular Jewish nationalism, things like that. Um, so, and then you had the reform movement and all these spiritual attacks trying to steal Jews away from their Judaism. So what happened was the analogy I always use is you watch these old Western movies they used to make. You can't make these anymore. When
Hmm.
the settlers in the 19th century, mostly post-Civil War, are really pushing out to the West. And the Plains Indians doesn't like that. You're taking our land, so they would attack the wagons. And the wagons would circle to make a little fort. And the indigenous, you can't call them Indians anymore. They're circling around, like, woo, and you drive them off. And what do? You don't stay there. You unhitch the wagons and you keep going. What we have seen, in my opinion, as a historian, is that the wagons have continued to largely stay circled. Some of them, they occasionally will foray out to scavenge, like the foray out to get some food, but the attitude, shockingly, I'm living here now, I'm in it, you see that the inability, I'm not talking about the extremist groups, I'm not talking about Torah Karta and Satmar, I'm even talking about the yeshiva world in America. It still is extremely standoffish when it comes to dealing with the whole notion of modern Jewish nationalism, of saying prayers for the state of Israel or for the soldiers. They will do Tehillim, the Psalms, for the matzah, which is a generic term for the situation because there's threats against Jews. But you see this even in Israel today, and because in Israel you have another problem, which is these are people who are living in the land of Israel, who by law are supposed to be serving in the army and paying taxes and integrating into the country and contributing into the workforce. Not that some of them aren't, but a lot of them are not. So there the issue is much more close and personal and much more problematic. And you see the pushback is really great. So really, if I had to summarize Ellie, I would say that the things have moved on, but not talking about the religious Zionist world, but I'm talking about the Orthodox Jewish world of the Hasidic, non-Hasidic, Lithuanian yeshiva world is, with varying degrees, still kind of stuck in a very reactive mode, which in many cases can be expressed in a very kind of extreme way. So when we get to what you asked about with the army and things like that, we've talked about the army before. I have my own opinions on it that are I hold personally that according to Maimonides, the Rambam, that all the wars that Israel fights are Melchemet Mitzvah.
Right.
Maimonides, the great medieval Jewish scholar, 1135 to 1205. You codified all of Jewish law. He says a mitzvah war is any war to conquer the land of Israel, to destroy Amalek, the arch enemy of the Jewish people, the ancient Adolf Hitler of antiquity, or any war where Israel is being attacked because an enemy is trying to destroy us. That's every war that Israel's fought. And in such cases, there are no exemptions, and that everyone should be going off to fight. Now, to qualify that, no army in the world absorbs this entire population, and not everyone is fighting in combat units, etc. But every army needs to have manpower, and we see with the ultra Orthodox, what we call Israel of today, the Haredi world is the fastest growing segment of the population. I believe in Jerusalem, it's 50%, it's 25% of the population in Jerusalem and 50% of the kids who are preschool.
Mhm.
They have very high birth rates. It's exploding. And you don't have to be a professor of economics to realize that when you have a huge segment of that population that is not in the workforce, that is learning full time, um, and is not contributing manpower to the army in any significant way, that is a recipe for disaster economically and security wise. And I don't want to get into all discussions of learning Torah, protecting. There's no question that our learning and our commandments do, but there's also no precedent anywhere that I see in Jewish sources in the Bible, any story that I know of, where we're being attacked and God says, okay, everyone should go off and learn. I believe that
Right.
if yeshiva guys today take off something like close to 2.5 months of Bein Zmanim, which is between the semesters that people are learning. But if we gave the army 2.5 hours off, we'd be in big trouble. And I'm wading into dangerous thin ice here, so I'm very careful what I'm saying. We need people learning. Ben Gurion, even though he was not
Yeah,
pro-religion,
but I think there's like a time for there's a
yeah,
season for everything. There's a time for
yeah,
everything. And I think part of the challenge is even if we just look at the Torah, there were times to fight and there were times to pray. And God would sometimes say, stop praying and move, right?
yeah,
Like enough already, let's go. So I think part of the challenge that we're running into is, first of all, there doesn't seem to be a nuanced, critical
mm,
non-reactive conversation within the secular and within the religious worlds about what is happening. And there isn't a non-reactive, calm, collaborative conversation going on between the secular world, the IDF, the religious world, and everybody's kind of siloed into their own things. And now we're in a situation where everybody needs each other but can't talk. And the animosity is so in the way of coming up with this. Israel's just incredibly creative with a startup nation. What we think we can't figure out a way to make the army work for religious kids and to make secular Israel more open and more connected to the religious world. It's just ridiculous to think that it's not possible. First of all, that as Jews we're incredibly creative and we can figure out anything. And not only that, Hashem's on our side. So like it's all possible. But I
yeah,
think the difficulty that that as you can see, it bothers me is that nobody's talking to each other to, first of all, even if you end up disagreeing, at least you'll understand. And to also be able to say, hey, this doesn't work for me. And there's been a lot of broken trust. And when, I think I brought this up to you earlier, this, article that I read about where even the Dati Lumi community is having a hard time right now because sometimes the IDF will put those kids in positions where it is against their values, where they're, being put in a tank with a bunch of girls and these are observant boys and that doesn't work for them. And they want to serve one of the largest populations of those who serve are these religious Zionist kids and they want to serve, that's not a question. But if you keep putting them in positions where they have to go against their Torah values in order to serve, it's the same kind of thing again. So it just seems like everybody's so siloed and not able to just talk to each other and have a calm, trusting conversation where we're saying, hey, we want to make this work for everybody because we have to make this work.
yeah.
And that's where it just feels so broken and stuck. And I really wish there was more bridge builders like, say, Rav Cook, or people who are able to start to put people in the same room and say, let's work it out, rather than being insane and crazy and saying bananas things in the Knesset that just inflames everything. It just seems like everybody's just pushing buttons rather than doing the opposite, which is creating environments for people to get together and figure this stuff out.
100%. Yeah, you're right. This is the world in general that there's no, the whole world is extreme opinions, and that's because the Jewish world is not being moderate in the middle. But like I'm saying, you're still getting from people. the same arguments for me when I have discussions with yeshiva guys and rabbis about the army. They still throw things out at me which are
Right.
simply not true anymore. There are definitely issues, but the notion, first of all, the army doesn't want us. That's crazy. The army is so short on manpowers. There's people who have given. I have a son-in-law who's done 600 days as a reservist in
Wow.
Gaza and Lebanon. My son has done
It's
over
unbelievable.
400 days. The national religious community, which is very religious and very serious, but is obviously committed to the idea of serving in the army as an obligation that they view as even a spiritual obligation, is suffering. A small percentage of the population has 40% of the casualties of the last, 2.5
Yeah,
years.
it's
So
horrific.
the situation cannot perpetuate itself, yet people are still throwing out the same lines. The army doesn't want us, or the army secularizes. One thing I know,
Right.
I did the IDF myself. If you send a kid whose Judaism is weak into a mixed unit that's largely not religious, it's not that it's going to make him secular, but there's going to be no support structure for him to stay religious. There are plenty of units in the army, the best ones being the Hesder units, where the guys do army and yeshiva in the national religious world, which not only is the army not taking them out, it's nothing like putting yourself in an intense experience in terms of teamwork and combat and fighting for something meaningful to solidify. And you see these guys are so motivated spiritually and physically to be protecting the state. So that notion, that the army doesn't want us, the army can't accommodate us,
Well,
it's a
I think
work
it's
in pro.
yeah,
Yeah,
I think it's also just to throw in because I've also heard that argument, oh, I'm going to send my kid in and they're going to become not religious and da da da. And while there is for sure challenges around making sure that the environments are kept appropriate and doable, eh, a lot of what happened in the past was the only kids that they sent to the army were the ones that were already not in a good place. They were sending the weakest of the kids who didn't fit into the yeshiva world, who were struggling. Those are the kids who are fine, you can go to the army. So then they end up with these kids who are already at risk, sending them to an at-risk situation. And what do they think's going to happen? So like
right,
the proof of the statement would be take your top people and send them
right.
in. And now tell us what happens because we're seeing tons of incredibly, beautifully, highly educated Jews who are committed, who are religious, going into the army and becoming leaders in the army, who are they themselves transforming the whole experience. You can't change things from the outside.
Right,
So
right.
I think it's also a good argument that we don't have a proof of concept of what it would look like to send the best, which is, I think, if I remember correctly in Tanakh, one of the things would be that you had to be a Torah scholar in order to study to be in the army. Like that there had to be a relationship between the two. Am I wrong about
Maybe it's also, but there's certain stories, the story of Gidon, and there are a couple of interesting stories that focus on that point of taking, it's not about power, it's about connection spiritually.
right?
But it's also, Ellie, it's kind of self-fulfilling, sort of like what we said about the rabbinic reaction to Jews going to Israel and America. These are dangerous spiritual places. If imagine if really good, solid, yeshiva guys from the ultra-Orthodox world were to go together as a unit into the army, it would create an incredible unit within the army. It's when you don't send the good guys in, or you don't send anyone in, only the stragglers who get picked off end up going in, then it's a self-fulfilling prophecy. But as you said
Yeah, and
before, yeah.
go ahead. No, you
It's
go.
not about let's draft all these Shiva guys. The army can't integrate all those guys in the army, but some have to go in. You have to play your part. No one's blood is redder than anyone other blood. There's people who are you cannot equate learning in yeshiva with being in a battlefield. I am sorry. When you go home and sleep at night and you're not putting your life on the line and disappearing from your family for 30, 60, 100, 90, days, it's not a matter of right or wrong. It's not a zero sum game. But what's happening is this extremist, either, on one side, we got to draft all these Shiva guys. Now, the Supreme Court, that I have a lot of issues with in Israel, because I believe it interferes too much with the legislature of Israel, is
Yeah,
very right on the point of this is not fair. A whole community, by virtue of, there's exemptions to the army from the left. People say, but look, there's more secular people in Tel Aviv don't do the army. There's lots of people who are not doing the army there either. Two wrongs don't make a right either. It's not a matter
correct.
of they get away with it, but what you don't have is like secular Jews in Tel Aviv saying, as secular Jews in Tel Aviv, we don't want to do the army. We want immediate exemption for everyone. There has to be some middle of the road way of doing this where we move out of the position of we can't do anything. We're still living in the same situation. Ben Gurion gave 400 exemptions in 1948 in the War of
Right.
Independence for the yeshiva world to rebuild itself out of the ashes of the Holocaust when it was really being destroyed. We fast forward 78 years later and we see there are 80,000 exemptions. And boy, there's no shortage of guys learning Torah. There's more people learning than
And
ever
by the way,
before.
I think it's fascinating because the argument about Israel in the first place was, oh, it's not religious, and we're going to send our kids there and they're going to become not religious. Well, they went from 400 to 80,000. So really the proof of concept is no, you can move to Israel and be religious and stay religious and da da da. So why wouldn't the same thing be for the army? The same way they thought if people moved to America or they moved to, like, if you are um, connecting for real your kids with Judaism, with Jewish values, with Hashem. It doesn't matter where they are. Sure, there's places that are going to be riskier, but what you think like Chabad in the middle of Thailand, like, on the top of a mountain, sure there's risks. But I think this whole argument that, well, what if my kid doesn't, stops being religious? That is more, I think, a you problem than it is a world problem, it seems to me.
Yeah. Yeah. But it's saying, what personally upsets me is don't, stop with, the arguments that our learning is what's protecting the country and things like that. And again, I'm not discrediting the impact of Torah learning and mitzvot. There's no
For sure.
questions there. But the honesty has to be, and this is true, that we are defensive, we're petrified of losing our children, and we don't want any outside influence.
Of course.
So we'll just keep circling the wagons, coming in tighter. And like I said before, it does not work. The best defense is a good offense. And Chabad is a great example. If you really believe that you got a mission, you send these people to places that have nothing and they thrive there. It's insane. I don't know how any that's the great strength of that whole with their ideology. But we have to recognize we have a product that is great. We have outlasted everyone. And we need to be thinking proactively about our mission in this world. It's not about survival and circling the wagons. It's about first creating a Jewish people and a Jewish state and spreading that out to the world. You cannot do that without the idea that we're part of one nation, collective responsibility. We're all in this together. My blood is not redder than yours. We all have responsibility. I'm all for, there are certain lots of people who the best thing they can do for the Jewish people and the Jewish state is to be learning. I think there should be, you know, definitely people. We need that. God knows we need that, but it's not like the
The
entire
fact that we
community.
have secure environments and countries where we can do that undisturbed is a miracle,
Yeah.
right? Like that, the yeshiva world was historically kept very small because you had to work or you were in danger.
Yeah, exactly. It's thriving. But the scariest part of all of this is not only forget that that it's the people taking it to the next level. The Peleg Yerushalayim people, or Shmuel Auerbach's people are this is the scariest thing to me that I see. It scares me more than Iran because we know that we're still kicking the can down the road and trying to work out a solution. Who's going to get drafted? Now that these parties are pushing for a complete across the board permanent exemption for everyone. That cannot be, but that just cannot be. It's just not sustainable economically and in terms of security for the country. But then you have a group, Peleg Yerushalayim, who are an Ashkenazi subgroup that is not insignificant. You see them in Bnei Brak and in Jerusalem, the big Jewish concentrations in Israel. And their thing is, yeah, today the law allows you to be exempt from serving in the army if you're a full-time yeshiva student. But to do that, technically, you need to go into the draft office and sign a piece of paper just attesting to the fact that you promised that you are learning full time in yeshiva and you will not be working. That's a fair deal, and seems to me all you got to do is show up and sign a piece of paper. So Shmuel Auerbach says, no, you cannot even go into the office to sign that piece of paper because they'll play with your head. They'll get you. So when you don't do that, then you're violating the law. You're not signing the paper. So it's happening every week now. They catch one of these guys, sometimes accidentally, and he gets arrested. Then there's massive riots in the street, destroying traffic lights, burning garbage dumps, throwing rocks and garbage at police, calling them Nazis and the girl soldiers shiksas and yelling and screaming and attacking the few, soldiers who are religious who happen to end up in places like Bnei Brak. And it's actually disgusting. It is horrible. and carrying signs that say, B'kol dor vador amdu aleinu lechalotenu, and every generation they stand over us and try and destroy us, which is what we say in a Passover Seder, as if the government of Israel is the czarist Russian government drafting 12-year-old Jewish boys into the army in the 19th century, or we will die rather than be inducted into the army or go to jail rather than it's so not healthy. Now, am I saying the majority of these people are doing this? No, they're not. The
Right.
majority of religious Jews are just minding their business. They're not pro-Zionist, but they're not out on the street calling police Nazis and blocking traffic and inconveniencing
Right.
thousands of Jews' lives. But it is horribly destructive because these are the people who, if we have to recognize, if our job in this world as Jews is to connect humanity to God by living and acting in a way that inspires other people. Every time I watch one of these videos, I want to cry because I know that all they're doing is making people hate Judaism.
Right.
These are the
Right.
most religious people. Look at how they're behaving. You have a right to protest, blocking traffic, making trains.
And it's not, and we all know that protest doesn't do anything anyways. So the idea that it's actually going to change policy is just nonsense.
Or
Like
go protest and
it's yeah,
yeah,
go
but go
stand in front of the Knesset, but
go
what?
stand
You're
in front of
standing
the
in the middle,
Knesset and yell.
you're just making a Hillel Hashem rather than actually impacting and changing the laws in any way. And you're making not only that, these young police, like national police, like they're having to deal with these kids in a way that just like they're pitting them against each other. It's terrible. It's taking two very hurt, wounded, scared parts of the population and literally sticking them in a tank together to just fight it out.
Yes.
It's absolutely untenable. And I think the leaders of the community who are, encouraging this are not doing what they're supposed to do, which is go talk to the people in charge. Like go actually do something about it. Stop sending your kids into the streets to do these crazy things. It doesn't make any sense to me.
Exactly.
It's
Exactly.
dangerous.
Exactly. And we just need an attitude change. And what's most scary to me as a historian, I've been saying this for decades, literally, is when we start fighting amongst ourselves. I've said this before, and I'll say it many times after. I've noticed before the first Intifada, the second Intifada, what happened October 7th, it's always internal fighting within the Jewish world. We said this last
Well,
episode.
we wonder why this agreement with Iran is going so awry.
Yep. Yep. You could argue that Trump is blowing it and he's like being outmaneuvered by the Iranians, and who knows what's going to happen. But I'll tell you one thing that's 100% clear to me. The reason why we didn't get a complete resolution to this and our greatest physical threat to us wasn't eliminated, in my opinion, I am not a prophet. I don't know this for sure, but I see the pattern, is because we're too busy fighting amongst ourselves. There was unity after October 7th, and now it's deteriorating. And you get videos like what you're seeing online on YouTube and the blocking the trains and yelling and the screaming and the hatred and the pilug, the splitting of the country. God's saying, I think, my children, you want to kill each other? I'll just send non-Jews to do it. Because the only thing that seems to work, is when I send someone to kill you, then you stop fighting amongst each other. It's kind of like what happens in the entire book of Judges. We don't listen. We're not doing what we're supposed to do, whether it's our observance or in getting along with each other. So it says explicitly in the book of Judges. So he sends someone to oppress us, and we cry out, and God sends a redeemer, a judge. And when the judge is around, the people listen. Unfortunately, we don't have those judges today. We don't have the clear leadership. It's not coming from the top down. And there's still people, you're still hawking the same lines about the state of Israel, this like left wings, anti-religious organizations trying to secularize us. And they just want to get a hold of our kids. And it's simply not true. We have to look at Jews differently. The Chazon Ish, by the way, who came from Eastern Europe in 1933, he's one of the real Ashkenazi founders of of the ultra-Orthodox community in Israel, who was very involved in the yeshiva in Bnei Brak, and he died in 1953. He wrote something very interesting. Maimonides introduced an idea of called tinuk shenishba. It's one thing when you're dealing with people who are openly anti-Torah. These people are enemies of the Jewish people. They're Jews, but they're enemies. They have to be dealt with very strongly. But when you have people who are just ignorant, one of the early Zionist leaders, Ahad Ha'am, Asher Hirsch Ginsburg, he had a great line. He said, we wanted to create a nation of epicorsim. We wanted a nation of people who knew, like a lot of the early Zionists, like Bialik, like people they knew stuff. A guy like Bialik who was in the Volozhin yeshiva, a guy like Ben Gurion who knew his Tanakh. He wasn't raised religious. He wasn't raised really in yeshiva environment. We want a nation of people who actually were connected. They knew the Bible, stuff like that. But we ended up with a nation of Amaratzim. We ended up with a bunch of ignorant people. One of the byproducts of what secular Zionism did as damage to the Jewish population was it stole their Judaism from them. And you have a lot of Jews running around today. Sure, if you live in Israel, your language is Hebrew. That's amazing. Your calendar is the Jewish calendar. Your holiday cycle is Jewish holidays. There's a lot of advantages that a secular Israeli in Tel Aviv has over the most religious guy in Lakewood in terms of his basic software operating package. But they are so shockingly ignorant of Judaism. It is unbelievable. So they wanted a nation of people who were like connected, Haram says. They knew the Bible, they knew this stuff, but they weren't keeping it. We ended up with just ignorant people. So,
And,
but
and by the way, just to say, not ignorant in an insulting way. Ignorant meaning they weren't given the opportunity to learn. They weren't provided with the infrastructure. Most secular Israelis I've met have never even interacted with a religious person because they won't speak to them, right? Like, so there's been a very specific bifurcating of the population that has advantaged no one.
Mhm. Exactly. Exactly. But the difference is, as I said all along this whole episode, about how things have changed. That is not Israel today. We don't have this core of like hardcore secular Zionists who have it as their worldview to de-Judaize the state of Israel. The Chazon Ish, we have to stop, and they have to stop being portrayed as this nefarious plot to destroy Torah. I see in magazines here in Israel and like my son is afraid to go to yeshiva because he's going to be arrested. There's a war against Torah. That is nonsense. The only people who need to be afraid of being arrested who are learning are the ones who are in Peleg Yerushalayim, refuse to go in and sign the document that allows them to learn full time by promising that they're not going to be working and they are really learning full time. So people here walking around in like Muncie and Lakewood thinking that the government is as a war against Torah. Give me a break. We have to stop looking that way. And the Chazon Ish said this years ago, more than half a century ago. He's talking about the Rambams, talking about how we view Jews who the idea is called tinuk shenishba that Maimonides brings down, that a Jew who's basically raised amongst non-Jews, he doesn't know any better. He didn't make a conscious decision to go the other way like a lot of secular Zionist leadership did that we mentioned previously. So the Chazon writes, he says, and it seems that this law about the harsh rule against secular Jews applies only in times when God's supervision is clear, like in a time when there were miracles and a heavenly voice, and righteous of the generations were under clear personal supervision. Heretics were then especially perverse in swaying the impulses towards lust and lawlessness, and at that time, clearing out the evildoers was protection of the world, for all knew that pushing the generation away brings punishment to the world and causes pestilence, war, and hunger to come upon the world. And that's the attitude of a lot of this Eastern European leadership over 100 years ago. But then he goes on to say, but when the divine supervision is hidden and faith has been uprooted from the doorways of the nation, that's the Jewish world today, such acts do not build a fence against lawlessness, but add to the lawlessness. Oh my God, this is like these riots today. For they will see it as an act of destruction and violence. God forbid. It's unbelievable how relevant this is. Since we are supposed to be fixing things, we should not apply this law when it does not lead to correction. Exactly. We're supposed to be bringing Jews back to Torah. Rather, we must bring them back through ties of love and put them in the rays of light as much as we can. Meaning, don't yell at a car Shabbos. When the car stops at a light, offer some grape juice and a cake and say good Shabbos, and let's make the Kiddush. I just want to end with one thought, Ellie, which is we have to pull back. And Rav Kook really brought this in, that it's more than about seeing, the secular, the religious Zionists figuring how to work with the secular Zionists. It's about seeing the redemptive nature of this process. In the prayer for the Medina, the prayer for the state of Israel, we say the rebirth of the state of Israel, Reshit Smichat Gelutenu, the beginnings of the sprouting of redemption. The vast majority of non-modern Orthodox religious Zionists people will not say that because they're still stuck in the notion this is a secular political endeavor. It's not the will of God. And I think we need to move out. I don't want to get a discussion of whether we should be saying that prayer or not, but what really needs to take place, the big change is we have to start recognizing that we are in the process of redemption, that the process begins before the physical arrival of this person we call Mashiach, the Messiah. Ezekiel talks about, in the English translation, he says, "You shall shoot forth your branches and bear your fruit for my people Israel, for the return is close at hand. Behold, I am with you, and I shall turn to you. Then you shall be tilled and sown and multiply men upon you, the entire family of Israel." And the Ramban, Nachmanides, the great medieval Jewish scholar, he says there's no clearer sign of redemption than that when the land blooms again and the Jewish people will multiply men upon you. And we see that this is the process that has happened. Despite the people 100 and something years ago said it's never going to work, we are definitely in that. And we need to start reframing this as to stop reacting, stop pushing back, to recognize that we are all in this story together. We are inexorably moving towards redemption. Please God, we should see it soon. The rebirth of the Jewish people in the land, the fact that the population of Israel has gone up by like 1,150% since 1900, which is more than 3 times what the world's population has done. The fact that the desert exports fruits and vegetables to the rest of the world, and Israel is the startup nation. And sure, it's got challenges, and sure, it's got problems. But all we're doing now by perpetuating these splits is we are slowing down the process and increasing the threats. And Isaiah, Yeshayahu, he says, about redemption, he says, "I will hasten in its time. Achishena be'ito." And it's contradiction. If it's in its time, what does it mean? I'll hasten it. It says, if the Jewish people merit it, I'll bring it now. Otherwise, we'll schlep it out. We'll have to go through a lot more suffering. But like I said at the beginning, all of human history is interplay between what we Jews individually and collectively do and God's will. And right now, because we don't have level-headed, moderate leadership, both in the non-religious world and in the religious world, and people are digging in, and especially in the religious world, the extremists who are not the majority of that world are taking control, and they're getting the headlines and getting on the news because Jews is news and religious Jews is bigger news. All it is doing is increasing hatred and kicking the redemption down the road. So what my kids, when they went to school, they used to sing this little song that said, "Eretz Yisrael bli Torah kamo guf bli neshama." The land of Israel without Torah is like a body without a soul. And thank God we have the Jewish people in the land of Israel. We have the physical infrastructure rebuilt. The spiritual infrastructure has exploded, thank God, in a positive way. All the Torah learning, which is not the exclusive purview of just one segment of the population. It says explicitly that Torah, Mereshet Kehilat Yaakov, it is the inheritance of the children of Jacob. It's really blowing up in the land of Israel. And now we need to proactively be changing the attitude. And if we're not going to get it from the leadership and the rabbinic leadership of saying, guys, what's in the past is in the past. Let's now focus on what our job is to create a Jewish state that has a physical Jewish presence and spiritually a Jewish soul. And the only way we can do that is not by keeping within our own little community and keeping everything out, but by opening up that community and welcoming and recognizing we're all part of this incredible experiment, which is the creation of modern Jewish homeland in the land of Israel as the fulfillment of our destiny. Then that's a game changer. That's an absolute game changer. And like I said, if we're not getting it from the top down, we need everyone listening to this. We have to start recognizing we can agree to disagree, but we have to recognize big wheels are turning. We're in a very dangerous situation. And instead of digging in and pushing back and being aggressive and argumentative, we have to listen to the other side, but work on compromise and recognize that it can't be a zero-sum game. We need compromise and move into the center. And when we get that, like I say, the thermostat on the tension within Israel will be turned down. And I can promise, again, I am not a prophet, but the external pressure on the Jewish people, the physical threats, the political threats, all of that will start to disappear. And then, as Isaiah said, I will hasten it. It will come, very soon and in our days. I just wanted to end with a short little quote from Rabbi Cook again. Again, I'm not a Cook student, but it's a beautiful quote. And we can end with that. He said, here it is. He says, the soul of Israel's transgressors, who, in the footsteps of the Messiah, he's talking about the secular Zionist of 100 years ago, are lovingly connected to the affairs of all of Israel, to the land of Israel, and to the renewal of the nation, is more amenable than the soul of those who have no faith in Israel. And that's exactly what he's saying, that these people, even the ones who came from the worst place on the deepest level, their soul knew they were part of something greater. And we have to all get our souls to recognize that too. And then we'll get the Jewish state we want, the land of Israel, which will be a body with a Jewish soul, which will be great for all of us. And we should see it soon and in our days.
Amen. 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 Awesome. All right. Thank you so, so much, Rabbi Ken Spiro. Thank you, everyone, for listening. Thank you for being a part of this. Just a little reminder that if you like some of the conversations that we're having, please check us out. The link is in the show notes. It's called Ko-fi, which is a place where you can support the work in any way that you would like to, so that we can keep doing these types of discussions. Please like, share, and subscribe the podcast. You can check it out on YouTube also. I think that's it for today. Thank you, Rabbi Ken Spiro.
Thank you, Ellie.
Bye for now.